Dr. Yi, I just want to thank you so sincerely for taking time out of your busy schedule to really talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. And before we jump into some of the questions around model minority myth, I'm wondering if you would be willing to give us just, a sort of a brief overview of your extensive work and certainly your expertise. Would that be okay if we started with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Dr. Yi. I am currently an assistant professor at the University of Washington Bothell, and I received my PhD in clinical community psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and my bachelor's degree in psychology from New York University.
Yes.
And so part of my job is to do research and teach. And so my research and scholarship really these days focuses on how Asian Americans navigate systems of oppression,
Mm,
particularly their experiences with race and racism and their engagement with social justice.
yes.
So I teach undergraduate courses related to that. Right now, I'm teaching one of my favorite courses of all time called Asian American Psychology. I also teach other courses in multicultural counseling and clinical psychology.
Mm.
I also worked as a therapist throughout my doctoral training, and so my clinical experiences are around culturally responsive individual group counseling, as well as a focus on outreach and prevention work with racially minoritized communities.
Thank you so much for that overview. And I'm wondering, Dr. Yi, you mentioned how your expertise is rooted in helping Asian Americans really navigate systems of oppression. And I want to dig into the model minority myth. It's something that I personally have really had to grapple with in my own therapeutic context and really separate myself from that. I'm wondering, would you be willing to share what exactly is the model minority myth and how does this myth generally shape our values around family, around achievement, responsibility? How is that connected?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. So the model minority myth or narrative in the US really lumps together all Asian
Yeah.
Americans, and it perpetuates this image of Asian Americans as uniformly successful academically and economically. And so you might have heard these stereotypes of Asian Americans being all good at math and science, being quiet, being obedient, hardworking, and so the model minority myth really ties those stereotypes
Mm.
to the narrative that these are inherent kind of cultural traits for Asian people. So Asian cultures value family, Asian cultures value achievement, Asian cultures value responsibility. And so when we talk about the model minority myth, like on the surface, it seems positive, right? It seems maybe even
Right.
harmless. And yet it really flattens the diversity of all Asian Americans, lumps them together. It dismisses kind of the historical, the social, the political consequences of that narrative, and it has real psychological, mental health
Mm.
consequences because it really hides the struggles of Asian Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk specifically about the struggles. I mean, isn't there something like 20 plus ethnicities
Mm.
inside of this umbrella of AA and HPI? And it's wild to think that there would just be one narrative that really tries to encapsulate the beautiful diversity of our community. I'm wondering, Dr. Yi, would you be willing to take me into, let's say we have this, this traditional Asian household,
Mm.
one that is stereotypically driven by achievement. I'm curious to know, how does our internalization of the model minority impact our kids or ourselves growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm really glad you brought up this internalization piece of the model
Mhm.
minority myth because we really do adopt these racialized narratives in
Yeah.
very explicit, but sometimes implicit, like subtle ways, right? And so when parents internalize the model minority myth, they often transmit these sometimes like explicit and implicit messages to their children that they must uphold those stereotypes, that they
Uh,
must academically, economically be successful. And research shows that that can really shape anxiety, depression, perfectionism. It's been linked to fear of failure, taking risks, fear of disappointing families, and kind of this general sense of feeling like as a child you're only valued for what you achieve and not who you are.
ah, ah. And I'm curious, what if your entire existence has been structured around this idea of I have to achieve, achieve, achieve?
Absolutely.
Like, what
Right,
does that
right.
mean? Like,
Yeah, it's a process. It's a
yeah.
process. It actually reminds me of a current study that I'm working on where I'm investigating perfectionism among Asian American college students.
Oh.
And a lot of the narratives and the ways that perfectionism shows up for them is that they tie their self-worth to their achievements, whether that's academic all the way to as little as maybe minuscule as like a hobby, right? And how well you are engaging in a hobby, right? So it really has a lot of layers to it, but kind of at the core layer, there's this core belief that that I'm only valuable and lovable, even if we want to get there, right?
Yeah.
Valuable if I achieve, if I attain that level of success.
So I don't let's say I don't attain this level of success, this bar that I have set for myself. What does that do to a person like internally?
Yes. So yes, it's linked to a lot of fear of failure and fear of making mistakes. And yet we are human. We of course make mistakes, right? And
Yeah.
so that is part of, I would say, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but part of the healing process for a lot of these Asian Americans that I've talked to is being able to unpack how the model minority myth, how this like outside societal narrative has
Yes.
seeped into our psychology, and then kind of unworking that and unlearning that, right? And developing a greater sense of compassion towards ourselves and learning that we are valuable just for who we are.
Just for
Right?
who we are. Oh my gosh, that is so incredible. And Dr. Yi, I'm wondering if you could share with us, what are some of the signs or behavior that someone is being influenced by this model minority myth, especially if when it comes to achievement or just working as hard as we can, hustling for our worth.
Mm-hmm.
How do we
Yeah.
know we're being influenced by it?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the hustle culture because that ended up being a huge part of the results for that study I just mentioned on perfectionism,
Mm.
whether that's hustle culture learned from parental influences,
Yeah.
peers, the rise of social media. I was interviewing college students, and so for Gen Z college students in particular, social media and hustle culture, whether that was perpetuated by their own friends, but just online or influencers,
Hmm.
has been such a huge piece. And then also the socioeconomic conditions that they are entering in this hyper competitive job market. I know that's a huge concern for a lot of college students. So it's a lot of pressures on oneself,
Yeah.
right? And when we talked, I know you mentioned parents earlier too, right? For parents, some of those signs are putting that disproportionate pressure on their children to
Mm.
attain prestigious careers and minimizing their child's interest if they don't lead to tangible success. I'm thinking of those
Yeah.
hobbies again. And
Yeah.
so parents influenced by the model minority myth may kind of have those disproportionate pressures, but also may unintentionally dismiss any mental health concerns, and seeing them as a weakness again, because the model minority myth perpetuates this idea that we are problem-free, successful
Yeah.
minorities.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned comparison, and I
Mhm.
imagine, thank goodness, like I didn't have personally social media growing up, although my kids are about to enter this world of like phones and social media and the internet. Can you talk a little bit about um, the impact that comparison has on a student or just a person generally? Like what is that, like isn't it okay for me to say, oh well, Dr. Jaki Yi, she's written all of these great papers, like I aspire as an academic to be just like that. Is there a difference between healthy and unhealthy comparison?
Yeah, I mean, as you're describing it, right? Like comparison could be meant to motivate in that way, right?
Okay.
But also comparison could teach others or children, I'm thinking, right? That they're always being measured, right? That they're
Oh
always
yes,
being measured, that they're
judgment.
always coming up short, So it could be
Okay.
ironic in that way when comparison's meant to motivate. It could also consequently lead to shame and burnout, right? And
Yeah.
that can follow children well into adulthood. Again, that study that I was conducting on perfectionism shows
Yeah.
that the roots were really started in the family context. And then add on top of that the hyper competitive kind of job market that, again, college
Yeah.
students are entering right now. That is an example of comparison at work, right?
I see.
So, yeah, there's a lot of influences. I'm also thinking of how a lot of my research participants talked about how their families would link kind of like Asian cultural and societal context. So, for example, like a Korean American participant was saying, well, my parents always tell me it's worse in Korea. It's worse in Korea. You have to
Mm.
go to cram school every night and you're ranked literally, like the student rankings are posted on the door, and
Yeah.
in even as young as middle school, right? And so there are those contexts of comparison that carry into
Wow.
Asian American context for sure.
Wow, that is intense. Yeah. Dr. Yi, you mentioned self-worth,
Mm,
shame, burnout. Um, I'm going to inject exhaustion. I have
mm,
certainly been in that burnout place and space. I'm curious to know from you, why do Asian Americans generally struggle
mm,
talking about emotions? And what are some of the messages that we have internalized
mm.
growing up that really shape that? Um, yes, I presume that the model minority myth certainly plays a factor in that as well.
Yes, definitely that. And then, yeah, as you asked that question, it reminds me of actually some psychological research that really names emotional self-control, like emotional I wouldn't say suppression, but it's self-regulation, emotional self-control
Okay.
as one of the key five Asian cultural values. Actually, I mean, can you guess the other four, maybe?
Really?
Can you
No
guess the other
kidding.
four? What do you think are the top five or key five Asian cultural values that Asian people share?
Family first,
Hmm.
or filial piety,
Yep,
uh,
filial piety.
achievement, financial stability,
Mm.
putting our head down and sucking up our emotions. God, I hate that
Emotional
one. No
self-control.
offense,
Hmm.
community. Really don't like that one. That's four. I can't name a fifth. I'm trying to think, racking my brain.
Hmm.
Um, speaking from my own experience, I don't know. I've never learned until my old age to really value who I am and
Mm.
separating that from what I do. I don't, so
Mm.
perfectionism, I don't know if that, I don't want to apply that to the entire community, but that is certainly something I struggle with.
You were mentioning like individual versus community, right? That's
Yeah.
another kind of one. So, yeah, yeah, emotional self-control, as we were just talking about,
Yeah.
filial piety, that family responsibility and
Yeah.
recognition through achievement. A third one, collectivism,
Oh,
right?
of course. Yes.
Collectivism, being very community, prioritizing the community over individual well-being. A fourth one is actually conformity to norms. So researchers have found that Asian cultures in general tend to value conforming to a norm, similar to collectivism,
Interesting.
right?
Yeah.
And that's very different from US American culture for
Yes.
sure, where oftentimes US culture is like, no, you should reject norms, right? So that's the fourth. And then the fifth is humility, actually, humility and
Oh,
being humble and
yes.
not bragging about your accomplishments. So yeah, psychological researchers tend to list these as the kind of five all-encompassing, generally shared Asian cultural values. And so when you asked about emotional self-control, right, that's that cultural belief that talking about your emotions, that's indulgent, self-indulgent, maybe even burdensome to others. And so many of us grew up with that message that emotions are self-indulgent. They're luxuries, and so survival often would come
Yes.
first, right, for a lot of our immigrant family backgrounds.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a very strong cultural value within Asian cultures.
Absolutely. And even though this is a huge generalization that the Asian American community generally is
Mm.
better off than previous generations where
Mhm.
it's a sense of survival and financial stability. Is that something that gets just passed down then through my family? Like we can't just turn it off, or is that so naive to say? But I'm looking for the on-off switch button.
I can completely relate to that. That actually is another study that I'm doing on scarcity mindset among Asian Americans.
Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned survival. I mean, some people have called it survival mindset, scarcity mindset, or scarcity trauma, even, right? And so scarcity mindset is the kind of set of beliefs that there's never enough. There's never enough
Yes.
resources to go around,
Yes.
money, time. You could even go down to like food, basic necessities. And so that's that survival mentality that gets transmitted across generations. And again, we see even in again, Gen Z college students is another sample that I was looking at, that scarcity mindset was passed down, whether it was again through implicit or explicit messages through their
Oh,
family that you need to save, and even hoarding showed up as a potential consequence of needing to save every little thing, because what if an emergency comes down the road,
yes.
right? Like what if something happens because of that lived experience from many of our previous elder generations, right, of living through survival, war, trauma, right, historical trauma. And so it is a valid and legitimate kind of a psychological consequence of living through some historically traumatic experiences. And so yeah, it's something that we learn to unpack in therapy and in community together.
I see. I see. And I so appreciate, I know we're going to get into healing, but I so appreciate that you just said it's valid to feel that because
Yes.
I imagine, and even as I speak with you now, I feel a little almost guilt, like, why didn't I know this? Or why didn't I disrupt this thinking, this scarcity mindset thinking prior
Mm.
to? Does the Asian American community, generally speaking, is that something we don't openly acknowledge? This idea of giving ourselves grace?
Mhm. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there's a lot of legitimate barriers to getting to a place of healing, to getting to a place
Mhm.
of compassion, right? I mean, Asian Americans are report a lot of low levels of help seeking, of seeking support for their mental health.
Yeah.
And we can trace that back to the model minority myth again, right? Being seen as problem-free minorities, but it also is potentially a gap in the resources that are available. There's not a lot of culturally responsive therapy, for example. Asian Americans, I think,
Yeah.
make up 5% of the US workforce in counseling and mental
Mhm.
health services. Very little. And so oftentimes, especially when we think about like first generation recent immigrants, the concept of therapy is very foreign, and potentially there's a lot of mistrust in that kind of healthcare system in the US. So there's
Oh,
a lot of reasons and legitimate, again, valid barriers
okay.
to getting to that place of healing. And yet now we're seeing second generation, third generation beyond advocating to break that mental health stigma in our communities, which is
Yes.
wonderful.
Could we talk about how we're seeing more second and third generation folks access mental health resources? You know, one of the things that I'm so disheartened, one of the statistics that keep me up at night is that suicide is the leading cause of death for students ages 15 to 24. Would you be willing to talk about the distress that students are experiencing? How does that connect to what happened to them maybe growing up?
These childhood experiences are so influential
Mm.
that carry into our adulthood. And so it is really important to take a look at these really key developmental periods of time. And for me, I mean, I study a lot of college students and I work in college context, right? And for college students, right, for many Asian American students, college is often the first time when therapy is accessible and normalized and at free rate for college students in particular
Mm.
with college counseling centers, and is somewhat private from family oversight, right? And
Oh,
so college is that key developmental period where you're in between kind of growing up from those childhood experiences, still maybe living at home even, right? A lot of my students commute from home, and then being able to enter emerging adulthood, right? And so it's often the first time that they start to have the language for what they've been carrying for years, that
oh,
stress, that
wow.
anxiety, as you mentioned, depression, suicide, right? Suicide being the leading cause for Asian American youth deaths, and so and loneliness and isolation,
Mm.
and this just persistent sense of not being enough, right? And so that sudden mental health kind of realization that can happen in college is often the first time that distress is allowed to even surface and allowed to be addressed, right? And
Yeah.
students can really take ownership over their own mental health journeys at that point to start to learn coping skills at the start to really start to address some of those childhood
Mm.
experiences. So it's a really pivotal time. So I really don't take it for granted that I get to work with
Yeah.
college students at that really key developmental period.
Yeah, absolutely. Are students coming to you with distress and asking you or you know, should I access counseling or you know, what is compelling, I guess, a student to access those resources? Or is it somebody, a teacher, a professor encouraging them to access the resources? I'm wondering um, what specifically are they experiencing when they decide to ultimately access the resource?
Mhm. I mean, logistically,
Yeah.
sometimes I hear from students that it's like, oh, we have six free counseling sessions per year. I've never been able to access something like that. Also, again, outside of insurance, outside of parental kind of,
Yeah,
oversight, right?
sure.
So even just logistically, that resource is available to college students. And that might be the first time that they've ever seen that being highlighted
Okay.
across campus, but also as a professor, I know a lot of us encourage our students to take care of their mental health.
Okay.
Also, of course, college is very stressful. It is a time where you
Yeah.
are taking academically challenging experiences, experiencing social challenges, again, entering the hyper competitive job market and the
Mm,
uncertainty of your future, right? So there are these kind of very common college student stressors that oftentimes start the mental health journey for a lot of students. And then once they start counseling, they start to learn, oh, how has my childhood and how
I
has
see.
societal narratives like the model minority myth impacted all of these stressors and how they're manifesting now.
It sounds like there has to be, like, there's a very specific context that
Yeah.
your university has really set up for students, that it's incredibly powerful to hear. So, from someone who is in power, a professor, to hear them actually talk about the opportunities or the reasons why. To your point, you don't have to be experiencing a mental health breakdown before accessing the services. I don't know, that was just an incredibly powerful learning for me as I was just listening to you talk about all of the reasons. So, my long winded way of saying thank you very much for saying that, because I think that that's going to help a lot of parents or just people in general.
Yes, in fact, like please don't go before a mental health crisis, right? Like
Yeah.
preventative work is so important.
Yes.
And so think of it as kind of a yeah, mental health preventative work to be
Yes.
able to take care of yourself before a crisis or before a tipping point like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I appreciate you saying that. If I'm a student in college and I realize that I'm holding myself to an unreasonable standard, I'm never satisfied with my performance. I'm wondering, could you talk about what's really happening underneath to that student? Is it just about switching off? Don't hold yourself to like such an unreasonable standard. Is there something else that that student is maybe experiencing? And
Mm.
if so, could you share with us what might that student be experiencing, given that limited context that I just shared, of course, acknowledging that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, if I were with that kind of student right now, I mean, the first thing I would try to tell them is that they're not alone. I mean, they're
Okay.
really not alone in feeling
Yeah.
that. Again, in my study on perfectionism among Asian American college students, so many of them expressed that internalized message that if I fail, then I am a failure, right? If I make
Yes.
a mistake, and if I slow down, if I, slow down my pace of my expectations, something bad will happen. I will be shamed in my community. I will be a disappointment. So
Yes.
that's kind of that underlying belief. And so again, college students and school in general can really expose that pattern and highlight that pattern because the stakes feel so high at that
Yeah.
developmental period. The comparisons feel endless at that developmental period.
Mm.
But yes, it traces back to many students just explicitly or implicitly internalizing that message that achievement is what keeps you valued. And so it is that first step of noticing that that is a pattern that is going on cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, and how can we start to break that down and challenge with a sense of compassion that they are not alone in this
Mm.
healing journey.
That's such a relief to hear that we're not alone. And I mean, I could identify with everything that you just shared. You said that noticing that is one of the key components. Can you give an idea of how a person can go about noticing that, or does it really require an external person or professional even to help them to notice that?
hmm Yeah, I mean, just tracing it back to some of the research that I've done on perfectionism, two signs which seem maybe contradictory in terms of showing that distress are overworking and then also procrastination. So those might be some signs that
Okay.
interestingly both point to that internalized messaging around achievement being kind of the key value piece and perfectionism, right? So you might see overworking and hustle culture and difficulty resting, difficulty engaging in any
Okay.
self-care, right? As kind of a classic way on the surface of perfectionism being manifested in Asian Americans. And then on the other hand, also procrastination.
Mhm.
Perfectionism and procrastination are highly correlated. The avoidance of working, the fear more so, right? The fear of failure being so debilitating that procrastination is how it manifests and not feeling like they can do and show up for the things that they want to do because they're afraid that if it's not perfect, then why
Yeah,
even bother trying,
that's so
right?
fascinating.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's so sad to see again, like perfectionism manifesting in different ways, but then the consequences, of course, academically and socially look different for those two pathways, but both are pathways that stem from that perfectionistic root.
I see. So, if I could ask you, Dr. Yi, if I'm a parent or a teacher or just someone who works with students, K-16,
Yeah.
and I'm starting to notice either the overworking or the procrastination, are there certain questions that I could ask to follow up with that student, to check in on that student? I'm so fascinated by what you're saying. How do I not just write it off as like, oh, you just want an A, and like I take my attention elsewhere? What can I be asking myself as someone who works with students?
It's a great question. Again, it's so wonderful, first of all, to even be noticing because so many Asian American students are overlooked when they're until they're at the breaking point, until they're in that crisis mode because they don't fit the stereotype of
Yes,
struggling, right? If we
yes,
only look for outward breakdowns like
yes.
that. So recognizing that kind of distress
Okay.
and supporting students before they reach that breaking point. I mean, we also know from Asian American psychological research that Asian Americans often show symptoms through physical symptoms somatically,
Somatic
right?
system. Okay.
Headaches, stomach issues, chronic fatigue, sleep problems. So even starting with asking how's your sleep lately, right? How is
Yes.
rest?
Yeah.
How's your stomach? How's your head? Just
Yeah.
even starting with some somatic symptoms can be an entry point to starting to open up the conversation to, did you know that those things are linked to our mental health and opening up that conversation from
I
there.
see. That's so helpful. Sometimes I don't want to pry. And so I'm curious to know, what would you say to that reluctance thinking of like, it's none of my business. That should be dealt with behind closed doors. Is there any advice that you could share with that person who might be wondering that maybe staying quiet is better than following up?
I mean, to me, I hear some traces of model minority narratives potentially, right?
Ooh,
In that
yes.
of feeling like, okay, we just need to keep our head down, be hardworking, keep quiet, keep with the status quo, right? And so some of those narratives might be internalized and manifested through an avoidance of talking about mental health struggles. But we know from, again, psychological research
Yeah.
that being able to just open up conversation, be curious, as you
Yeah.
said, and not jump to solutions, right? Just to be, it's so powerful just to be heard and understood and to not feel alone. So oftentimes that can be, I guess, the first step, right? The first goal that we can take towards helping young people on their mental health journeys.
Oh my gosh, that is so incredible, Dr. Yi. Like just to sit with that for a second and how you were able to actually detect that in the narrative that I was telling myself, that that is a trace of model minority thinking. And it sounds as though actually the best thing we can do by students all the way up to college, graduate school, maybe the adults, Asian American adults that we work with, is to actually work on ourselves. That
Mhm.
feels like that's a key component to this process of um, supporting mental health
Mhm.
and accessing resources.
Yes, that self-work for sure. And it's often done in community, right? I mean, I
Oh,
think of some of the most powerful experiences that I had as a clinician were in group counseling, as well as I view my Asian American psychology classroom as kind of a healing community in a way, because in community, we learn about the model minority myth. In community, we learn about Asian American mental health stigma. And yes, that self-work is important, but often it's done through community and it leans on that collectivistic spirit of Asian cultures. And
Yeah.
so it can feel really culturally congruent to do this work in community too.
I see. I see. Can you give some of our listeners insight into what does that feel like? Because I'm having a reaction right now to what you're saying, and you're saying in community, and I'm like saying, "Oh no, this is very private, Dr. Yi. Like, I don't want people to know about my mess." And I'm wondering if that's also connected to my perfectionism. But I'm curious to know, what does it feel like when you say that I'm working on this I'm learning about this in community?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense, right? Because
Okay.
again, because the cultural values of collectivism, conformity to norms, humility, even, right? And that filial piety, a lot of that connects to this idea
Wow.
of feeling like you need to save face, is maybe
Yes.
what I'm hearing, right? Like you need to protect our reputation because it reflects on the whole group, right? And yeah, I would say that the process of healing in community, as you were asking, often starts with just a little bit of vulnerability on everyone's part. If everyone can create a community where they feel both safe and challenged, that they can challenge themselves to be a little bit vulnerable, it starts to incrementally add up to more and more emotional vulnerability. So that's what I hope to scaffold, right? You wouldn't want to start with trauma dumping on each
Yeah.
other, right? So
Yeah.
we start small and then we build trust, and again, it
Wow.
can be really, really powerful to healing community and see other people's vulnerabilities come together to help each other and to support each other in the
Oh,
end.
that's so beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Yi, for sharing that. Is it okay if I just want to watch at first?
Yes,
Is that a way of participating? And then as I feel, as I feel safer in the community, then maybe I can tiptoe into talking about my own stuff.
of course.
Of
Of
course.
course. Yes, yes. Oftentimes, again, in group counseling models, we often sit in a circle and you always have the opportunity to pass. That's definitely a helpful rule. And yeah, you often have maybe people who have been in the group longer so they can kind of take the lead and model for other people. So there's a lot of suggestions for kind of setting up the space to be as safe, but again, challenging as possible.
I love that you've said safe quite a few times. I'm curious to know because I'm still in the process in my own therapy journey of discerning between what's good for me and what's not. And I'm curious to know, what are some of the hallmarks of a safe environment? Can you identify what are those characteristics?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of also, I mean, any therapeutic context. I'm drawing from kind of what foundational people in therapy, you might have heard of like Carl Rogers. He created humanistic therapy, person-centered therapy.
Okay.
And also is just one of the founders of like counseling psychology in general. And I'm reminded of like how he outlines that the necessary conditions to have a safe environment in a therapy relationship are that the therapist must have empathy and unconditional positive regard for their clients, right? For their patients, that they must feel that they'll
Yeah.
create a non-judgmental space to accept any human emotions, mistakes, and flaws, right? So acknowledging that all of us have our vulnerabilities is kind of one of the key foundations to safe and effective therapy. And so about that in the classroom too, right? Like how do we create empathetic conditions and the sense of non-judgmental, unconditional, positive regard for each other, that we will give each other the benefit of the doubt as well as challenge each other to grow.
I
Yeah.
see. Yeah, that is very, very helpful. I think that when you said the word unconditional, what does
Mhm.
unconditional feel like?
Yes, yes, definitely. Again, you're not
Yeah.
alone in that. That is a
Okay.
very common experience. Even when I bring up that kind of notion of unconditional positive regard, oftentimes we have that gut reaction of like, unconditional. Does that mean you
I have to do
really you
something for you?
accept? Yeah,
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
you accept me completely as I
Yeah.
am with
Yeah.
no strings attached and all of that. So, yes, it really is about acknowledging that we are all human in this human experience with that range of emotions, and that we can accept any of those emotions within ourselves and within others, right? And so
Mhm.
being able to, again, non-judgmentally accept those emotional states is part of that unconditionalness of a safe environment. And so
Yeah.
trying to be able to model that by validating and hearing everyone out in a circle, whether it's that group counseling model or in a classroom setting, or one-on-one with parent to child, right? Like being able to fully embrace that they are human and that any emotion is acceptable, and then learning how to non-judgmentally react and know what to do next is
Mm.
the next key step.
I think, like practically speaking, so how, if I am someone who has not experienced unconditional love, like what would be a first step?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And if you don't know what that quite feels like, I think that it's really important to acknowledge that something like emotional attunement, that's like a learned skill. It's not something that's inherent in us.
Oh,
Right? Like it's a skill that we can teach. And as someone who teaches multicultural counseling and
yeah.
helps therapists in training, like that's something we teach our students, right? So
No kidding.
yeah, it's a practical skill and a practical place. Like one practical place to start is building more vocabulary around emotions. I teach like the feelings wheel, if you've ever heard of like a feelings wheel. It's a tool that a lot of therapists use
Okay.
where it starts with, okay, we know our key emotions like happy, sad, bad, disgusted, scared, right? But then a feelings wheel gives more and more vocabulary of contentment, satisfaction, surprise, shock,
Mm.
resentment, shame, and it just gets more and more layered. So just, I mean, that's one step, right? Like learning that, oh, there's a whole emotional vocabulary out there. And instead of being always constantly being like, am I okay? Am I fine? But instead asking, what am I feeling right now? Taking out the feelings wheel, knowing, oh, is this frustration? Is this anxiety? Is this grief? Naming emotions. That's oftentimes
Wow.
a place to start
My
with
head,
learning the skill.
this
Yeah.
is like totally blowing my mind because like emotional attunement is something that I can read about in a book, and
Mhm.
like that feels very much in alignment with the way that I learn. Like if I can access it in an
Yes.
article or a book and
Yes.
start learning about it, that could be a very concrete first step that any parent or leader or whoever who wants to become more emotionally attuned to the person that's sitting across from them, that's something that they can literally do.
Yes, it's
Wow.
something you need to like for sure learn. And then also again, college students, I mean, especially Gen Z college students entering this world is it's really an essential personal interpersonal skill that is very important in our ever-changing kind of AI landscape, right? Like just all of the complications in our job market. I tell students really like, whether you enter the helping professions or not, learning emotional vocabulary and emotional attunement will really help you personally and professionally.
Okay, I see.
Yeah,
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Well, you mentioned we're entering this world of AI. I'm wondering if we could switch gears and
sure.
talk a little bit about that. Um, a lot of our kids, generally speaking, we've been trained to compete on grades, test scores, credentials. If achievement was the primary identity, what does that mean for this generation? What do they actually need to do? I know we just talked about emotional attunement as a critical professional
Mhm.
skill. Are there other skills that we can start thinking about
Mhm.
building up in our youth?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree that like emotional attunement would be a definite place to start. Learning to pause and acknowledging, okay, something inside me is feeling something, it's reacting to something. Let me get curious about that instead of usually our default is to criticize ourselves. Oh,
Yes.
like I should just shove it down, right? So being curious about it rather than critical, having that non-judgmental, unconditional stance towards yourself. And again, kind of drawing back from that research on perfectionism that I've been doing. I mean, can you guess what the number one antidote is to perfectionism among Asian Americans? What do you think is potentially like the number one thing that they said has been helpful in challenging their perfectionism?
Oh my God, this is as a die-hard recovering perfectionist. I
Mm.
feel like I should know this. What is the one thing? I guess taking action, imperfect action. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm at a loss, Dr. Yi. I don't
Yeah.
know. What do you
No,
think?
that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Oh, is that
taking,
it? Taking
challenging
action?
yourself to take imperfect action, right? Like doing the opposite of the overworking piece, right? Or procrastination, especially like taking one small step, right? Is really, really important. I will say that a lot of the participants were saying that
Mm.
self-compassion, which we had touched on a little bit earlier, right, was the
Oh,
number one like antidote to perfectionism for a lot of the
really?
students. Self-compassion being that you are kind to yourself, right? Despite whatever, right? That unconditional kindness towards yourself. It's also not just that, it's also being mindful. So mindfulness, and having that non-judgmental stance towards your thoughts and feelings.
Mm.
If you've ever practiced mindfulness meditation or meditation in general, one of the main things in that is like, oh, I can have a thought, I can have a feeling, and it'll just pass, right? Like this is
Uh-huh.
it can be kind of so transient.
Yeah.
We have a bajillion thoughts a day, right? So being able to notice, okay, I have a thought, it is just a thought, right? Can
Yeah.
I let it go? Does that thought serve me? So mindfulness is part of self-compassion. And then one of my favorite parts of self-compassion is this idea of common humanity, which is super in line with Asian cultural values of collectivism again, that we are all in this together. There's a common humanity that we all are flawed human beings living in this difficult world. Can we have compassion for ourselves and for our brothers and sisters and communities, right?
Mm.
So self-compassion, it's a huge shift from perfectionism where you're constantly hard on yourself and you're thinking that that if I fail, I am a failure. Instead, if I fail, can I reframe that as that was a mistake? I'm learning and I'm in the process of taking action to one by one, step by step, challenge that perfectionism when I can. So I would say that that's another huge, huge
Yeah.
antidote and helpful piece to the puzzle.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you for sharing that. What
Mhm.
does the narrative in your head actually sound like if you are trying to give yourself grace for not meeting the mark? Like, what is something concrete that a person might be able to say to themselves?
Yeah, and if that's hard to come up with,
Yeah.
again, you're not alone in that because we're so
Oh,
used to talking to ourselves with that inner critic.
yes.
So oftentimes like one of the key exercises that you can do to practice more self-compassion is what would you tell a friend? What would you tell a loved one? What would you tell someone that you really love unconditionally? Because hopefully there's someone in our lives that we
Yeah.
feel that love towards unconditionally. What would you say to them? What would you say to your younger self, right? Who
Yeah.
that inner child, right? Someone who might have not known certain things that now you do know, right? So that's one way to start reframing it in your mind is
I
kind of
see.
how would I talk to a loved one or a young child, my younger
Hmm.
self in this situation? And oftentimes it's that I did the best that I could in that moment with the resources that I had.
Yeah.
Now that I know what is triggering me or what is challenging me right now, how do I want to move forward? Again, with a sense of kindness too, because I know that motivating myself with kindness is going to bring me farther than motivating myself with criticism.
Oh, that's so true. Where does that inner voice come from? Like that critic? Is there a specific childhood experience or I'm thinking the perfectionist in me is thinking, how do I avoid doing that with my own kids or like building that in I don't want them to have that critical narrative in their head.
hmm Yeah. And to an extent, right? Like I would say that it's not something that we can fully get rid of
Oh,
given the world we are, right? We live in a hyper competitive world. So
okay.
of course there's going to be narratives that are going to be really hard to challenge and not internalize that I feel like to an extent all of us have an inner critic inside of us,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
But or and right? Like it's something that can we have that also another voice in our head that's more self-compassionate, that's more willing to treat ourselves with that self-compassion and treat ourselves like a loved one would, right? So it's not about getting rid of an inner critic because
Okay.
again, to some extent, that's almost an impossible task given the world we live in. As well as it's something that, a lot of folks might say, oh, well, to some extent, I want to motivate myself, right? But it's learning what's that line, what's that threshold where we can learn, okay, this is not motivating me. Instead, this is demotivating me and leading me to procrastinate, for example.
I see.
Instead, how can I treat myself with that compassion and loving kindness to be able to motivate myself to do what needs to be done? Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you so much for saying that. Dr. Yi, we're coming up on the hour. I'm curious to know, is there one book that has really changed your life that you could recommend to our community to consider?
I love that question. I do love books. Definitely part of my social media stuff that I do is definitely almost like a book talk and loving to share books written by Asian American authors on psychology and mental health. And for me, memoirs are really, really powerful. And for me, what kicked it off my love for memoirs written by Asian American authors is Crying in H Mart. If you've ever read
Oh,
Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner.
incredible.
Also, one of my favorite bands of all time is her band, which she's like a musician of Japanese Breakfast is the name of her band. So I've never felt more seen by a memoir, and it really just kicked off my
Mm,
obsession with reading memoirs to understand that one's about grief in particular,
yeah.
and understand mental health concerns among Asian American
Mm,
communities.
that's a good one. Yes. What does courage mean to you?
Yes, I love that question too. So yeah, I guess similar to my research participants and challenging perfectionism, I think of them, I think of how courage for them and for myself, I feel like it means not letting the fear of failure stop you from
Mm,
taking action. Similar to what we discussed too about Asian Americans and emotional self-control, right? Like courage to me also means showing up little by little, vulnerably and authentically, and again, also in these really tough socio-political economic times, I think courage also means building solidarity across groups who are experiencing oppression at this time, such
yeah.
as Asian Americans, and fiercely challenging together inequality in community.
That is, oh my gosh, that is a battle cry, Dr. Yi. I love that. What do you courageously aspire for in your professional and your personal life?
Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, it does really remind me personally of actually my dad. He was a teacher and an educator for life, and his favorite motto is to dream big. And so I always try to remind myself to dream big and dream of making a big impact and serving my community. And he also loves to share the quote by, I believe she's an educator who was in the Challenger space shuttle, the NASA teacher
Mm.
program. Her quote that my dad loves to quote all the time is, I touch the future, I teach,
Mm.
which is one of my favorite quotes because it really shows that by teaching and through the profession that I've chosen and through really also personally, if I can teach and impact one life, I'm able to touch that future and be able to serve and make an impact on my community. So that's what I dream of for sure.
Oh, that's incredible. Impact is certainly what you have had on our community. And for that, Dr. Yi, we're so grateful and so thankful. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Courage Class. I hope today's conversation gave you a little encouragement and inspiration. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And for extra motivation, tools, and behind the scenes content, sign up for my newsletter. I'd love to share with you more there. See you next time. All right, and now for the legal language. Courage Class with Dr. Lindsay Kwok Yu and content posted by Dr. Lindsay Kwok Yu is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast or website is at the user's own risk. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional diagnosis or treatment. Users should not regard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical or mental health condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professional for any such conditions.